and magnitude of his sufferings in the great hells. That is the measure and magnitude of his sufferings, that he will experience sufferings for just so long. In this way, virtuous sons and daughters of good family will turn away from these deeds conducive to the ruin of Dharma. Even to save their lives, they will not reject the Dharma, because they fear they might meet with such sufferings. Subhuti. A son or daughter of good family should become well restrained in the deeds of their body, speech, and mind. For they do not want to experience such sufferings, and do not wish to be prevented from seeing the Tathagata, from hearing the Dharma, and from seeing the Sangha. Do not want to be reborn outside the Buddha fields and without encountering a Buddha. Do not want to live among poverty-stricken humans, and, for when this action expressed by speech, which rejects Dharma, has been done and heaped up, then an action conducive to the ruin of Dharma has been done and heaped up. The Lord. When this action, expressed by speech, which rejects all dharmas, has been done and heaped up, then an action conducive to the ruin of Dharma has been done and heaped up. Just here there will be deluded persons who have left the world for the well-taught Dharma Vinaya, and who will decide to defame and oppose this perfection of wisdom. But to defame and oppose the perfection of wisdom means to defame and oppose the enlightenment of the Buddhas and Lords. And to defame and oppose that means to defame and oppose the all-knowledge of the Buddhas of the past, future, and present. And to defame and oppose that means to oppose the Dharma. To oppose the Dharma means to oppose the Sangha. And when the Sangha is opposed, then the world-right views and the supramundane are opposed, as well as the 6 perfections, the 37 dharmas which act as wings to enlightenment, the holy truths, too. All knowledge is opposed. When all knowledge has been opposed, then an infinite mass of demerit has been acquired. And when such a mass of demerit has been acquired, then also an infinite mass of ill and sadness has been acquired. The 4 causes of the karma obstacles. Subhuti. Those who oppose this deep perfection of wisdom, O Lord, by what modes do they oppose it? The Lord. By 4 modes do these deluded men oppose this deep perfection of wisdom. Which 4? These deluded men are under the influence of Mara. They are unpracticed in deep dharmas, and have no serene confidence in them. They have settled down in the 5 skandhas, and they have fallen into the hands of bad spiritual directors, practice in faulty ways, exalt themselves, and depreciate others. Endowed with these 4 modes, those deluded men will reject the deep perfection of wisdom. Subhuti. It is hard to feign confidence in the deep perfection of wisdom for one who is unpracticed, lacks in wholesome roots, and is in the hands of a bad spiritual advisor. The Lord. So it is, Subhuti. Subhuti. How deep then, O Lord, is the perfection of wisdom, since it is so hard to gain confidence in it? The Lord. Form is neither bound nor freed, because form is without the own being of form. The past starting point of form is neither bound nor freed, because it has non-existence for its own being. The future end of form is neither bound nor freed, because it has non-existence for its own being. A present form is neither bound nor freed, because it has non-existence for its own being. Subhuti. It is hard to gain confidence in the perfection of wisdom. If one is unpracticed, has planted no wholesome roots, is in the hands of a bad teacher, has come under the sway of Mara, is lazy, of small vigor, robbed of mindfulness, and without self-possession. The Lord. So it is, Subhuti. The general character of absolute purity, the purity of form, is identical with the purity of the fruit. Moreover, the purity of form, too. The purity of the knowledge of all modes is the purity of the fruit. The purity of the fruit is the purity of the perfection of wisdom. The purity of the perfection of wisdom is the purity of form 2. The knowledge of all modes. It is thus that the purity of form 2, the knowledge of all modes, and the purity of the fruit, and the purity of the perfection of wisdom are not two nor divided, are not broken apart, nor cut apart. The different forms of absolute purity. The disciples are purified of the obstacle of the defilements. Moreover, subhuti, what is the purity of the self that is the purity of form, and what is the purity of form that is the purity of self? It is thus that the purity of self and the purity of form are not two nor divided, are not broken apart, not cut apart. So with the purity of a being, a living soul, a person, 2. One who sees. 2. The purity of one who sees is the purity of the knowledge of all modes. The purity of one who sees is the purity of the knowledge of all modes. The purity of the knowledge of all modes is the purity of one who sees. For they are not two nor divided, are not broken apart, not cut apart. Moreover, subhuti, from the perfect purity of self results the perfect purity of form. From the perfect purity of form results the perfect purity of self. It is thus that the perfect purity of self, and the perfect purity of form, are not two nor divided, are not broken apart, not cut apart. Moreover, subhuti, from the perfect purity of greed, hate, and delusion results the perfect purity of form 2. The perfect purity of the knowledge of all modes. It is thus that the perfect purity of greed, hate, and delusion and the perfect purity of form 2 of the knowledge of all modes are not two nor divided, are not broken apart, not cut apart. Moreover, subhuti, from the perfect purity of greed, hate, delusion results the perfect purity of form. The Pratyeka Buddhas as purified of a part of the obstacle of the cognizable. Moreover, subhuti, the purity form 2. Consciousness is the purity of the fruit, and so on, until we come to the purity of ignorance. From the purity of the karma formations results the purity of consciousness, from the purity of consciousness results the purity of name and form 2. From the purity of old age, death, sorrow, lamentations, pain, sadness, and despair results the purity of all knowledge. It is thus that the purity of old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and despair and the purity of all knowledge are not two nor divided, not broken apart, not cut apart. The bodhisattvas as purified of the covering on the path of triple vehicle. Moreover, the purity of the perfection of giving results from the purity of the perfection of giving. And so for the other perfections. For the various kinds of emptiness, too. From the purity of the special Buddha Dharmas results the purity of all knowledge. It is thus that the purity of all knowledge and the purity of the special Buddha Dharmas is not two nor divided, not broken apart, not cut apart. The varieties of absolute purity. E11, the weakest path. Moreover, the purity of the perfection of wisdom is the purity of form. The purity of form is the purity of everything up to the knowledge of all modes. It is thus that the purity of the perfection of wisdom and the purity of form and the purity of the knowledge of all modes are not two nor divided, not broken apart, not cut apart. And so for the other skandhas, and for the perfections. The medium weak path. Moreover, from the purity of inward emptiness, 2. From the purity of the emptiness of the non-existence of own being results the purity of the knowledge of all modes. It is thus that the purity of inward emptiness, 2. The purity of the emptiness of the non-existence of own being and the purity of the knowledge of all modes are not two nor divided, not broken apart, not cut apart. From the purity of the skandhas, elements, sense fields and conditioned co-production. 2. From the purity of the 10 powers, the grounds of self-confidence, and the special Buddha dharmas results the purity of the knowledge of all modes. It is thus that the purity of the skandhas, elements, sense fields and conditioned co-production, and the purity of the perfections, the dharmas which act as wings to enlightenment, the holy truths, the unlimited, the trances, the formless attainments, the 8 emancipations, the 9 successive attainments, the emptiness, signless and wishless, the superknowledges, of all concentrations and all dharani doors, and the purity of the 10 powers. The grounds of self-confidence, the analytical knowledges and the special Buddha dharmas, and the purity of the knowledge of all modes are not two nor divided, not broken apart and not cut apart. Moreover, the purity of the knowledge of all modes and the purity of the perfection of wisdom are not two nor divided, not broken apart nor cut apart. The strongest weak path. Moreover, from the purity of the conditioned results the purity of the unconditioned, and from the purity of the unconditioned the purity of the conditioned. It is thus that the purity of the conditioned and the purity of the unconditioned are not two nor divided, not broken apart, not cut apart. Moreover, subhuti. From the purity of the past results the purity of the future. From the purity of the future the purity of the past, from the purity of the past and future the purity of the present, from the purity of the present the purity of the past and future. It is thus that the purity of the past and future and the purity of the present are not two nor divided, are not broken apart, are not cut apart. End chapter 35. Note. Followers of the Bodhisattva vehicle may get more benefit from listening to the sutras actively by reading along with a peaceful voice, and walking on a treadmill very slowly to avoid drowsiness. Keep this in mind. Wishing or dreaming to do the goodness is the first steps of doing good, it does not matter one can do it or not. It is the same for wishing to become a Buddha. Bodhisattvas are those people who vow to gain enlightenment in order to bring about unchanging happiness for all living beings. And again, it does not matter they can do it or not.